In a candlelit hall where nobles laughed at her silence, one man's cruelty echoed louder than the music. The Duke, draped in velvet arrogance, mocked her before the court, turning her dignity into the evening's entertainment. He thought she was powerless, a shadow to be dismissed, a pawn in a world ruled by titles and wealth. But history has a way of bending. What begins as humiliation can transform into judgment. And one day, that very Duke would stand trembling under her gaze, not as his victim, but as his judge. This is not just a tale of pride and downfall. It is a story of betrayal, ambition, and a woman who refused to be erased. Subscribe now to our channel and join us as we step into a world where power shifts like shadows, and where those mocked in silence sometimes return as the voice of destiny. The year was 1738, a time when names carried more weight than actions, when lineage determined worth, and when silence was often demanded from those born without power. In the court of a small but influential duchy in Central Europe, a young woman named Isabella de Montclair stood in the shadows of grandeur. She was not noble by birth, but her education, poise, and wit had granted her rare entry into circles far above her station. To most, she was invisible, a necessary ornament, a quiet observer, tolerated, but never fully accepted. It was during one winter's ball that her fate took a cruel turn. The Duke of Valmont, a man both feared and envied, had fixed his gaze on her. Known for his ruthless tongue, he thrived on turning people into spectacles. With a glass of wine in hand, he called out her name before the assembly, questioning her manners, her origins, even the faint trace of nervousness in her hands. A lady of letters, yet without a family name, he sneered. "Tell me, Isabella, do you read history to forget your own absence from it?" Laughter spread across the hall like fire catching dry straw. She lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of every mocking smile, every gaze that reminded her she was tolerated, not respected. But beneath her humiliation was a resolve. For every cruel word, she carved a silent promise into her heart. One day, she would rise so high that even the Duke would kneel to her presence. In the weeks that followed, Isabella's path became one of restraint and strategy. While whispers of her humiliation lingered, she quietly positioned herself as an indispensable advisor to the Countess of Brienne, a woman whose influence extended far beyond her apparent role. Isabella became known for her precision with words, her ability to recall treaties, histories, and precedents that many nobles themselves had forgotten. She learned to mask her emotions, to smile where once she would have trembled, to answer cruelty with intelligence sharpened like steel. Meanwhile, the Duke of Valmont thrived in his cruelty. He was a man intoxicated by his own importance, feared by rivals yet careless with allies. His lands were rich, his soldiers loyal, and his political reach vast. But beneath the surface of his triumphs lay arrogance, the kind that blinds men to the cracks forming in their foundations. He had enemies waiting for his downfall, though few dared move openly against him. Isabella, watching quietly, began to study him as one might study an opponent in a game of chess. His habits, his alliances, his greed, all were noted in her mind. What he never suspected was that the very woman he had mocked most brutally was becoming a figure of influence in legal and diplomatic circles. Nobles, once dismissive of her, now sought her counsel in disputes and contracts. To the Duke, she was still nothing, a shadow in the corner of gatherings. To others, she was becoming indispensable. Yet Isabella's rise was not fueled by revenge alone. There was something deeper, an unshakable belief that dignity, once taken, could be restored through justice. She understood the fragility of power better than most. It could be handed down by birth, but it could also be stripped away by the very laws and courts the nobility ignored until they needed them. Years passed, and the duchy began to change. Political tensions grew, alliances fractured, and a wave of reforms spread through Europe, shaking even the most entrenched dynasties. Isabella's knowledge of law and her skill in negotiation positioned her at the center of these transformations. She advised ministers, drafted proposals, and, most crucially, became a voice in the creation of a new judicial council, one with the authority to hold even the highest-ranking nobles accountable. The irony was not lost on her. The same Duke who once laughed at her was now among those whose influence would be scrutinized under this new system. Isabella, once a girl mocked for her lack of history, was helping write a new chapter for the duchy itself. But destiny's hand moved faster than anyone expected. One spring morning, a sealed document arrived at Isabella's chambers. It bore the crest of the Judicial Council, newly established, and inside was a list of cases to be reviewed under charges of corruption, mismanagement, and abuse of power. Among the names, bold and unmistakable, stood Duke of Valmont. For a long moment, she stared at the parchment, her breath unsteady. The man who had humiliated her before the entire court was now to stand trial. And she, Isabella de Montclair, was not merely a witness to history, but one of its architects. Yet what unsettled her most was not his name, but the faint realization that others too had plans for his downfall. Plans that would drag her into a web of betrayal and danger far darker than she had ever imagined. The document trembled in her hand as she understood. This was not only justice, it was the beginning of something far more perilous. The Duke of Valmont had lived for decades believing his power untouchable. Yet now his name sat inked on a list destined for the council chambers. When word spread quietly through noble corridors, fear and curiosity followed. Few dared speak openly, but whispers filled every salon. Could the Duke truly fall? And if so, who dares bring him down? Isabella knew the truth. The Judicial Council was more than a symbol. It was a blade hanging over men like Valmont. But she also understood the danger of touching a man like him. His wealth was vast, his influence threaded into the very structure of the duchy. To bring him to trial would not only shake his power, but threaten everyone who had benefited from it. That included some of the very ministers who sat on the council. At first, Isabella thought justice might be straightforward. Evidence of his misdeeds was abundant. Misused taxes, lands seized from poor tenants, soldiers dispatched to intimidate rivals. But she soon discovered that corruption runs deeper than parchment and seals. Each time she gathered testimony, another door closed. Witnesses were threatened. Clerks who might reveal forged accounts vanished or swore sudden loyalty to the Duke. It was as though his arrogance had been replaced with a desperate cunning, a man who sensed that his enemies were circling and would claw at anyone who approached. And yet something else haunted Isabella. Within the council itself, she sensed hesitation. Several members whispered of delaying proceedings. Others spoke of finding a compromise. In truth, many feared the ripple effects of Valmont's downfall. If one duke could be tried, who was next? The entire noble order felt the tremor of danger. But Isabella was not alone. Among her allies was Minister Armand Duclair, a reformer known for his sharp tongue and fearless disdain for old power. He believed Isabella's role in the council was essential, and he urged her to press forward. "History remembers only those who dared," he told her one evening, his voice low as candlelight flickered across parchment. "If Valmont falls, it will prove the law stands above title. That is the only legacy worth leaving." His words strengthened her resolve. Yet she could not ignore the unease that crept into her thoughts. Armand was bold, almost reckless. He wanted change at any cost, while Isabella believed justice must be precise, not vengeful. Still, their alliance held, bound by ambition, necessity, and perhaps an unspoken respect. Neither dared to confess aloud. As the weeks unfolded, the Duke himself seemed strangely calm. He continued to host dinners, attend gatherings, and walk through court with his chin high. Some mistook it for arrogance. Isabella recognized it as calculation. He was waiting, perhaps even plotting, something unseen. Then came the evening that unsettled her most. At a gathering of nobles, she entered the hall only to find Valmont himself across the chamber. Their eyes met briefly, and though years had passed since that winter's humiliation, the memory returned with burning clarity. He raised his glass toward her in a mocking gesture, lips curling into the faintest smile. It was not the grin of a man who feared judgment. It was the look of someone who believed he still held the winning hand. That night, Isabella found a letter slipped beneath her door. The handwriting was elegant, unfamiliar. It contained no greeting, no signature, only a single line. "Those who judge Valmont will soon be judged themselves." The warning chilled her. Was it from the Duke? From one of his allies? Or from someone within the council itself? The meaning was clear enough. His trial would not proceed without blood, whether metaphorical or real. As the investigation deepened, Isabella uncovered something more disturbing. Hidden among financial records was evidence that the Duke had not acted alone. Several ministers, men who now spoke of justice, had signed documents approving his seizures, his misused funds, his deployment of soldiers. Valmont's power was not built on solitary corruption, but on shared complicity. If he fell, so would they. This revelation shook Isabella to her core. She had believed in the council as a beacon of reform, yet here was proof that many within its walls were tainted. And suddenly, she understood. Valmont's calm was not arrogance. It was insurance. He had the power to drag half the council down with him. The realization left her sleepless. If she pressed forward, she would be striking at the very foundations of the government she had worked to build. If she faltered, she would betray her vow to uphold justice. She stood caught between silence and danger, between truth and survival. But fate forced her hand sooner than expected. During a closed council session, one of the ministers proposed striking Valmont's name from the list, claiming lack of evidence. Before Isabella could respond, the chamber doors burst open. A messenger entered breathless, clutching a sealed order. He handed it to the presiding judge, who read it aloud with trembling hands. By decree of the Grand Regent, the Duke of Valmont was to be summoned for immediate questioning. His trial advanced by months, without warning. Gasps filled the chamber. Isabella's heart pounded. She knew this could not be coincidence. Someone somewhere had forced the regent's hand. But who? And why now? The summons spread through the city like a spark across dry fields. For years, the people had murmured about Valmont's arrogance and greed, but no one had imagined he might stand before the council as an accused man. Markets buzzed with speculation, taverns overflowed with whispered predictions, and in the grand square, citizens gathered in hushed clusters, waiting for the day when the Duke himself would be called to account. For Isabella, it was a moment heavy with contradiction. She had longed for justice, had worked tirelessly to see the law rise above bloodlines, and now it was happening. Yet the speed of the regent's decree unsettled her. Someone had maneuvered behind the scenes, pulling strings with precision. She asked herself again and again, was this truly justice? Or had Valmont simply become the pawn in another's game of power? The day of the hearing arrived beneath a gray, swollen skimmy. The council chamber, with its tall windows and stone walls, felt colder than usual. Nobles, ministers, and citizens with influence crammed the galleries, their faces taut with anticipation. At the center, the Duke of Valmont stood dressed in black, his silver hair gleaming, his expression unreadable. He neither bowed nor blustered. He stood as though the trial were nothing more than another performance in a life built on spectacle. When his charges were read aloud, embezzlement, unlawful seizure of property, abuse of military power, the room buzzed with restrained shock. Isabella, seated among the council, felt every eye flicker toward her, as if she were the architect of this moment. She did not flinch. Instead, she met Valmont's gaze directly. For a heartbeat, time seemed to rewind to that night of her humiliation, when his laughter had filled the hall. But now there was no laughter, only silence between them. Witnesses were called. Farmers spoke of their lands stripped from them. Soldiers testified to orders given that violated treaties. Merchants revealed accounts drained without record. Each word chipped away at the Duke's facade, yet he listened with calm, even faint amusement. And when his turn came, his defense struck like a dagger. Yes, I took lands, he admitted with disarming ease. Yes, I ordered soldiers. But I did so with signatures. Signatures of men who now sit on this very council. His voice echoed through the chamber as gasps broke the stillness. You dare accuse me? Then accuse yourselves. My power was not mine alone. It was built on your consent, your silence, your shared greed. Murmurs turned into uproar. Ministers shifted uncomfortably, faces pale, lips pressed tight. Isabella's stomach knotted. This was the weapon she had feared he would use. Truth sharpened into a shield. He was guilty, yes, but he would not fall alone. The presiding judge called for silence, yet order felt fragile, as though the very walls of the chamber strained under the weight of scandal. Isabella spoke, her voice measured, carrying the authority she had learned to wield. The law does not bend to confessions meant to spread guilt like ashes in the wind. Each man shall be judged for his deeds, not for the convenience of another's defense. For a moment her words steadied the room, but she knew the trial was no longer simply about Valmont. It was about the system itself. And in that fragile pause, Valmont looked at her with a faint, knowing smile. History will remember this day, he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. Not as my fall, Isabella, but as the day you joined the game you once despised. The trial stretched for hours, but when the verdict was finally declared, it struck with thunderous finality. The Duke of Valmont was found guilty of corruption and stripped of his lands, his titles, his privileges. Gasps turned into shouts, some of triumph, others of fear. The mighty Duke who once mocked a young woman into silence now stood as a man undone, his arrogance reduced to ashes. And yet as guards led him from the chamber, he did not stumble, nor beg. He walked upright, head held high, and as he passed Isabella, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. They cheered for your justice today. Tomorrow they will cheer for your ruin. Her breath caught. The chamber roared with the noise of victory, but his words lingered like poison. For in the eyes of many nobles now trembling at what they had witnessed, Isabella was no longer merely an advisor, no longer the quiet woman mocked at a winter's ball. She was power itself, the embodiment of a justice that could strip any man bare. And power, she knew, was both crown and curse. History is not written only by kings and dukes. It is shaped by those who dare to stand against them. Isabella's story reminds us that dignity, once stolen, can be reclaimed, but justice always comes at a cost. Those who rise must carry the burden of power's shadow, where admiration and fear walk side by side. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold histories, stories of ambition, betrayal, and the hidden hands that shaped the world we live in.